The morning sun had barely risen when an elderly black woman shuffled into the grand marble-floored bank downtown. Her clothes were tattered, her shoes worn thin, and her gray curls peeked from under a faded scarf. People turned their heads, some wrinkled their noses, others whispered, their laughter low but sharp. To them, she was just another homeless woman, another soul forgotten by time. The security guard frowned as she stepped closer to the teller, clutching a dirty handbag that had seen better days. But what no one knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that the woman they mocked was not who she appeared to be. Beneath the disguise of poverty stood the true owner of the very bank they worked for, a billionaire testing the humanity of her own creation. The story begins with Margaret Collins, an 82-year-old woman whose quiet strength had carried her through a lifetime of hardship and triumph. Years ago, she had built an empire from nothing, starting as a cleaner, saving every penny, and investing wisely until she became one of the most successful real estate magnates in the country. Yet despite her wealth, Margaret had always feared that her company and her employees had lost touch with compassion, that the culture she had once built on kindness had turned cold and corporate. So one morning, without warning, she decided to see for herself what had become of the world she had shaped. Dressing herself in ragged clothes, smudging her face with ash, and tying her hair in a worn scarf, Margaret looked nothing like the elegant woman who usually appeared in board meetings or on magazine covers. She stepped out of her chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, miles away from the city center, and made her way through the streets like a drifter, carrying only a small purse with a few essentials and a secret. Inside that purse was a cashier's check worth $50 million, drawn directly from her private account. She wanted to see how people treated her before they knew who she was. When she entered the bank, she could feel the stares. The security guard, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, immediately stiffened. "Ma'am, you can't be in here like that," he said with authority. Margaret lowered her head and mumbled softly, "I just need to check my account, sir." The guard frowned, glancing at her clothes, the dirt on her shoes, and the frayed straps of her bag. "This isn't a shelter. You need to leave." But before he could escort her out, she managed to slip past and approach the nearest teller window. Behind the glass sat a young woman named Denise, her hair sleek and her makeup perfect. Denise barely looked up before sighing dramatically. "Ma'am, if you don't have an account, you need to go somewhere else," she said impatiently. Margaret smiled faintly and handed over the folded piece of paper. Denise looked at it with a smirk, assuming it was some sort of nonsense, until she unfolded it and saw the numbers. Her mouth fell open slightly. This can't be real," she whispered. The security guard, seeing Denise's sudden change in expression, leaned closer. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Denise shook her head, still stunned. Margaret simply waited, her calm presence unnerving in its quiet dignity. Denise quickly picked up the phone and called the branch manager, her voice trembling now. Within minutes, a tall man in a sharp navy suit came out of his office, irritation written all over his face. "Ma'am, we can't have people wandering in here causing." He stopped mid-sentence as he looked at the check in her hand. His tone changed instantly. "Oh, my apologies. Mrs. Zuat, did you say your name was—" Margaret smiled faintly. "Collins. Margaret Collins." The color drained from his face as the realization hit him. He had read that name countless times. It was the name engraved on the brass plaque outside the bank. Collins Financial Group. The whispers that had once filled the room turned into stunned silence. The same people who had sneered at her now looked at her with awe, disbelief, and shame. The guard who had nearly pushed her out froze, unable to meet her eyes. Denise, the teller who had rolled her eyes moments before, tried to apologize, her voice shaking. Margaret said nothing. She simply looked around the marble floor, the polished counters, the pristine uniforms, all symbols of the success she had built, and wondered when compassion had become a weakness in her empire. As Margaret stood there, the bank manager stammered through his apologies, trying desperately to regain composure. "Mrs. Collins, if we had known, if only someone had told us." But Margaret raised a hand gently. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect," she said softly. The words cut through the air like glass. The staff froze. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The calm in her voice carried more power than anger ever could. She looked at Denise, who had tears welling in her eyes. "When someone comes to your counter," Margaret continued, "you see the dirt on their hands before you see the person inside. That's not what I built this company for." Her gaze then shifted to the security guard. "And you," she said, "you saw a problem to remove, not a person to help. Have you forgotten what it means to be human?" The crowd of customers watched in silence, some visibly uncomfortable. Margaret turned her attention to them. "You all laughed when I walked in. Why? Because I looked poor. Because I didn't fit your idea of success." She took a deep breath. "Let me tell you something. Poverty doesn't erase dignity, and wealth doesn't define worth." The manager begged her to come to his office, but she refused. "No," she said firmly. "I want to stand right here, where everyone can see and remember this moment." She took out her check and placed it gently on the counter. "This," she said, "isn't about money. It's about character." She told them about her past, how she had once been homeless herself after her husband's death, how she had stood in lines for food, slept in church basements, and faced the same judgmental stares she saw today. "I know what it feels like to be invisible," she said. "I vowed that if I ever made it out, I'd never let another soul feel like that in my presence." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. Somewhere along the way, the world forgot empathy, but not me. Word spread fast. Employees from other departments came rushing to the lobby, whispering and pointing. A few customers tried to apologize, offering to help her now that they knew who she was. But Margaret shook her head. "You see, that's the problem," she said sadly. "You only want to help when you see power. What about those who have nothing to offer you?" She asked the manager to gather every employee in the branch for an emergency meeting. The staff stood awkwardly, guilt written across their faces. Margaret began walking slowly among them, her worn shoes making soft echoes across the marble floor. "You all represent this institution," she said. "You handle people's dreams, their savings, their futures. But if you can't handle them with kindness, then this building means nothing." Denise began to cry openly now. The security guard removed his hat, shame flooding his face. Margaret turned to him. "Son," she said softly, "I don't blame you. I blame a system that teaches you to fear the poor instead of understand them." The words hit everyone like a quiet thunder. Margaret then made a surprising announcement. She pulled out a folded document from her bag, a transfer order. "This bank," she said, "will now launch a new division, a foundation for housing, food, and employment for the homeless. Every branch will contribute 5% of profits to it. And the first donation," she smiled, handing the paper to the manager, "will be from my $50 million. The room gasped. "And," she continued, "the first people I hire for the foundation will be those who walked in here today looking for help and found only rejection." The entire atmosphere shifted. People looked at her with reverence now, not pity. She had come disguised as a nobody, and yet, she left as a living lesson, one that no one present would ever forget. Later that evening, the story went viral. A customer who had filmed part of the encounter posted it online with the caption, "Homeless woman revealed as bank owner teaches everyone a lesson." Within hours, millions of people had watched it. News anchors, bloggers, and talk shows discussed the moment endlessly. But for Margaret, the viral fame wasn't the point. She hadn't done it for headlines, she had done it for humanity. The next morning, journalists swarmed outside her mansion, eager to get a comment. Margaret stepped out, still in her plain clothes, and addressed the crowd. "I didn't disguise myself to humiliate anyone," she said calmly. "I did it to remind everyone, especially those who have power, that respect is not something you give only to the rich. It belongs to every soul on this earth." She revealed that this wasn't the first time she had done such a test. In fact, she had quietly visited several of her own companies over the years, under different disguises, sometimes as a janitor, sometimes as a struggling mother, each time, observing how people treated her when they thought she was beneath them. "You can tell a lot about a person," she said, "by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them." Her foundation soon became one of the most successful charitable initiatives in the nation. It partnered with shelters, food banks, and local councils to create job training programs for the homeless. The same bank branch where she had been mocked was now transformed into a pilot center for community aid. Denise, the teller, personally volunteered at a soup kitchen every weekend. The security guard began mentoring young men trying to get back on their feet. The entire culture of the company shifted, but Margaret didn't stop there. She began hosting workshops for CEOs and executives, teaching them the value of empathy and leadership. "Compassion isn't weakness," she'd tell them. "It's the foundation of every lasting success." Her speeches became legendary, not because of her wealth, but because they carried the authenticity of lived experience. Years later, when Margaret finally passed away at the age of 90, her story remained a parable of modern times. People remembered her not just as a billionaire, but as the woman who wore rags to remind the world of its heart. Her portrait hung in the main lobby of every Collins financial branch, not in her elegant attire, but in the very outfit she wore that fateful day, her old scarf, her humble clothes, her gentle smile. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "Wealth measures success, but kindness measures worth." Her legacy became a movement. The foundation continued to grow, sponsoring education, housing, and healthcare for thousands. Every year, employees across the country reenacted her story as a training exercise, reminder that every face, no matter how worn or weary, hides a story you don't know. And so, the tale of the homeless woman who walked into a bank became more than a viral sensation. It became a mirror to society's conscience. For behind her disguise, Margaret Collins had shown the world that the true currency of life isn't money, it's humanity.